Something is breaking apart at the seams right now, and most Americans have no idea how serious this actually is. Israel has informed the United States that it is running critically low on ballistic missile interceptors, and that single sentence should stop every serious American in their tracks. This is not a headline. This is a warning signal from the battlefield that the architects of this war never wanted you to hear. Israeli defense systems entered this current conflict already depleted after last year's fighting with Iran, when large numbers of interceptors were used to block incoming missiles. For each projectile, 2 to 3 interceptors must be fired, and the cost of a Patriot interceptor runs $4 million, a THAAD interceptor $12 million, against an Iranian Shahed drone that costs $50,000 to produce. Do the math. Iran doesn't need to win militarily. Iran needs to outlast the ledger. Tehran is pursuing a deliberate attritional strategy, attempting to saturate Israeli, U.S., and Gulf air defenses in hopes of depleting interceptor stockpiles. It fired more than 1,200 missiles and drones in the first 48 hours of the war alone. Iran perceives that it is in an existential conflict and does not appear to be interested in an immediate off-ramp. From Iran's perspective, a cessation of hostilities would merely be a temporary respite before the United States or Israel restart the conflict once they have replenished their military supplies. Therefore, a slow, protracted war of attrition is probably Iran's intended outcome. And Washington? Trump has said the war could end soon and has recently taken to describing it as a short-term excursion. But Trump, Israel, and Iran are all signaling that they're willing to fight for as long as it takes. This is not strength. This is a nation discovering mid-battle the cost of decisions made without honest counsel, without restraint, and without a clear definition of what victory actually looks like. Now let's slow down and think about this with the clarity that the moment demands, because what we are watching unfold in real time is not simply a military engagement between powerful nations. What we are witnessing is a fundamental test of American strategic judgment, and right now, that judgment is failing to meet the weight of the moment. On February 28th, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran under what officials called Operation Epic Fury. The targets were military facilities, nuclear sites, and leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in those opening strikes, along with numerous other Iranian officials. Washington expected a collapse. They expected that the removal of Khamenei, combined with the political unrest that had been building inside Iran since January, would cause the regime to fracture, the population to rise, and the conflict to resolve itself in days. That is not what happened. More than a week into the war, Iran was still fighting. Despite losing its supreme leader and several senior military officials, the country's war machine did not collapse. Iranian forces continued to launch missiles at Israeli targets and strike U.S. military bases across the entire region. This is the part that every American needs to understand clearly. The people planning this operation did not fully account for the one thing that history keeps teaching us over and over again. A nation fighting on its own soil, defending its own existence, does not simply stop because its leader is killed. It fights harder, it fights angrier, and in Iran's case, it fights smarter. Senior fellows at the Stimson Center have described this conflict as rapidly becoming a war of attrition. The United States and Israeli militaries are now in a race to intercept Iran's missile capabilities, its launchers and production facilities, before the U.S. and Israel's own stockpile of air defense interceptor missiles in the region is depleted. That is the core strategic reality right now. Not whether America can strike Iran, not whether American aircraft can fly over Iranian airspace. The question is whether America can sustain its defenses long enough to achieve something that still has not been clearly defined as victory. Think about the numbers for a moment, because the numbers tell the story better than any political speech ever could. Each THAAD battery costs roughly $1 billion, and the United States operates only a limited number of them worldwide. Iran's daily operational expenditures in this conflict are by far the lowest of any party involved. Launching an Iranian drone may cost roughly $20,000, while intercepting that same drone can exceed $500,000. This is not a war of firepower equivalents. This is a war where Iran is bleeding America's treasury one cheap drone at a time, and they can do it for far longer than Washington is willing to admit publicly. Trump posted on Truth Social on March 2nd that the United States has a virtually unlimited supply of certain munitions and that wars can be fought forever using just these supplies. But the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, had already expressed concern before the war began that the U.S. munitions stockpile had been significantly depleted. So the president is saying one thing, and the man responsible for actually managing military resources is saying another. That gap between the political narrative and the operational reality is precisely where wars are lost, not on the battlefield, in the boardroom, in the press conference, in the refusal to tell the American people the truth about what this is actually costing. The Army Vice Chief of Staff, General Christopher Leneve, testified before a Senate Armed Services Subcommittee and admitted he did not have a good estimate of how fast munitions are being consumed. Right now, we don't have a good estimate on what is being clearly burned, he said. The Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army does not know how fast America is burning through its weapons in an active war. Let that sentence settle into your mind for a moment. That is not a minor administrative gap. That is a fundamental failure of readiness and accountability at the highest levels of military leadership. And while the skies above Iran and Israel absorb this grinding attrition, the economic consequences are already arriving at the doorstep of ordinary American families. Starting on March 4th, Iranian forces declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, threatening and carrying out attacks on ships attempting to transit the waterway. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow passage between Iran and Oman, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, is the single most important choke point in the global energy system. About 20 to 30% of global oil and gas supplies are shipped through the Strait of Hormuz. When it closes, the world does not simply find another route. There is no adequate alternative. The pipelines that exist cannot compensate for the volume. The strategic reserves being released are buying time, not solutions. Brent crude surged above $100 per barrel for the first time since 2022, with the S&P 500 falling 1.4%, the Dow Jones dropping 674 points, and the NASDAQ sliding 1.6% in a single day. American retirement accounts, American pension funds, American gas stations, they are all absorbing the cost of a military decision made in Washington that was presented to the American people as swift, decisive, and certain. Gasoline prices in the United States rose above $4 per gallon, the highest since late 2023, while the consumer price index complications raised fears that the oil shock could wipe out the gains made in the inflation fight. The very thing that American households have been struggling against for years is now being reignited by a conflict that had no clear exit strategy before the first bomb was dropped. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the man America killed, broke his silence and declared that the Strait of Hormuz must remain closed and that Iran will continue its attacks on its Persian Gulf neighbors. He did not offer negotiations. He did not signal a desire for off-ramps. He issued a statement of war. The IRGC's spokesperson told the world plainly, "You will not be able to artificially lower the price of oil. Expect oil at $200 per barrel. The price of oil depends on regional security, and you are the main source of insecurity in the region." Whether that number is accurate or not is almost beside the point. The message is the message. Iran has turned the Strait of Hormuz into a weapon, and they are wielding it with precision against the global economy. Around 500 oil tankers remained anchored in the Persian Gulf, unable to move, as Iran's de facto blockade paralyzed the flow of energy to Asia, Europe, and beyond. Tanker traffic dropped first by approximately 70%, and shortly thereafter to virtually zero. The shipping lanes that fuel the industrial economies of Japan, South Korea, India, and China went dark. And here is the layer that most commentators are not fully connecting. The conflict is materially improving Russia's competitive position in crude oil markets. With Middle Eastern barrels facing logistical disruption, both India and China face strong incentives to deepen their reliance on Russian supply. America went to war in the Middle East and handed Russia an economic windfall. That is not a side effect. That is a strategic consequence that anyone who studied the map and the markets would have seen coming. Iran began considering allowing a limited number of oil tankers to pass through the strait, but only if the oil cargo was traded in Chinese yuan. Read that again. Iran is using the leverage of this war to push the world toward a non-dollar energy trading system. This is not accidental. This is a convergence of interests, Tehran's survival instinct meeting Beijing's long-term currency ambitions, and it is happening because America launched a war without apparently calculating all the second and third-order consequences that serious strategic minds would have demanded to be modeled before the first aircraft crossed Iranian airspace. Trump called on other nations to send warships to help keep the Strait of Hormuz open, while the USS Nimitz, one of the largest warships in the world, had its service life extended to March 2027, nearly a year longer than originally planned, as the U.S. remains at war with Iran. America is now asking other countries for help securing a waterway that its own actions destabilized. That is not the posture of a confident, prepared superpower executing a well-designed strategy. That is the posture of a nation that moved faster than its planning could support. Washington's stated goals have included degrading Iran's nuclear program, ballistic missiles, navy, drones, and control of its terror proxies, but Iranian ballistic missile attacks managed to penetrate Israeli and U.S. missile defenses. Given the limited stockpile of interceptors and Iranian ambitions to eventually ramp up production of ballistic missiles to numbers that could overwhelm Israeli defenses entirely, the timeline pressure on this conflict is real and structural. You cannot simply wait Iran out. The longer this goes, the more interceptors are depleted. The more depleted the interceptors, the more exposed the cities and the bases. And the more exposed the bases, the more pressure on Washington to either escalate further and or find an exit that doesn't look like one. Iran called on neighboring countries to expel foreign aggressors from the region, while its foreign minister stated that Tehran would target American companies' energy infrastructure across the Gulf if Iran's own oil and energy facilities were struck. This is how wars expand, not through formal declarations, but through incremental escalation, each side responding to the other's last move, each side calculating that the other will blink first. The problem is that neither side right now appears to be blinking. The American people deserve to hear this plainly. The question was never whether America could hit Iran. The question was always what comes after. And right now, what comes after is a closed waterway, rising fuel prices, a depleted interceptor arsenal, an ally signaling stress, a new Iranian supreme leader vowing continued warfare, Russia gaining economic ground, and a president telling the public that supplies are unlimited while his own generals cannot give Congress an accurate accounting of what is being consumed. That is the true picture of where things stand. And no amount of triumphant language from behind a podium changes the arithmetic of what is unfolding in the Persian Gulf today.